Welcome to another Fantasy Insiders. Hello everyone, welcome to another Fantasy Insiders Instant Impact video. We are of course talking about Demaryius Thomas being traded to the Houston Texans. Sorry for accidentally starting this stream on my Twitter handle, but we are now talking about the Fantasy Impact of Demaryius being traded. So first, to talk about what happens to the Denver Broncos. Of course, Courtland Sutton is now a full-time starting wide receiver for the Denver Broncos. He was already kind of coming on. He was actually a buy low on the Josh Hermsmeyer air yards model kind of, every single week, just because he was getting some high-value targets down the field. But Demaryius was definitely taking away from Sutton's ceiling, and Sutton was actually taking away from Demaryius's ceiling as well. But that problem is now rendered obsolete. And looking at the target profile on the Denver Broncos, we're removing 56 targets away and 4.5 receptions per game away from the Broncos offense, and we're basically transitioning. I sort of expect Thomas. I expect Thomas's absence to mean that Sutton gets pretty much all of that work. I don't think that, Tim Patrick, Deshaun Hamilton, I don't really think that those guys are going to be big target values in the Denver offense. I don't expect a big uptick for Hireman or for Matt LaCosse. I think this team will transition into playing a lot of 12 personnel. I think that we're going to see a ton of LaCosse and Hireman out there as blockers. Hireman, a very good blocker. LaCosse, more of a receiving tight end. But Sutton, for me now, basically takes over Demaryius's position in terms of where I ranked him weekly in fantasy. Sutton is really a low-end wide receiver too now. I think Sanders' target volume, I don't really think this does much for Sanders, but Sutton now, he's going to be a start for the rest of the year. So now we should talk about Demaryius's value in Houston. I think this is obviously a pretty big boon for Thomas. He just was not a very effective receiver this year. 3 touchdowns, only converted 36 of his 56 targets into reception, averaging only 11.2 yards per reception. Compare that to 19.1 yards for reception for Courtland Sutton, 13.2 for Sanders. And Sanders actually had a much lower depth of target as well. So I think Thomas is now in a much better situation for him. He's going to fit right in to the Texans offense because him and Hopkins run similar kinds of routes. I know we think of Demaryius as old and washed. And the first thing I guess I should say about Thomas is no, he is not old and washed. And he's going to be replacing a role on the Texans offense that vacated 45 targets and 623 air yards in Will Fuller. As of right now, Coutee only has an average depth of target of 5 yards, and Fuller has an average depth of target of 13.8. So Coutee is now going to be the deep threat. He had incredible long speed at Texas Tech. He played there with Patrick Mahomes, and that was really what he was good at, was getting down the field. So it was kind of a surprise to a lot of us. It was a surprise to me and to a lot of people in the fantasy community that Coutee was used in such a role to be close to the line of scrimmage, to run a lot of slant routes, to run a lot of bubble screens. So the Houston offense going forward, you have DeAndre Hopkins at the X, and you have Demaryius Thomas at the Y. Will Fuller is now going to be the slot wide receiver, but in 2 wide receiver sets, it is going to be Hopkins and Thomas. And, if people in your league get crazy about Coutee or get crazy about Sutton or even Emmanuel Sanders, I think that offering a trade for Demaryius Thomas right now is actually pretty sharp, because I think that he's playing with such a better quarterback now. Deshaun Watson is just better than Case Keenum, and so looking at this Denver offense, Sutton 32nd in the NFL in air yards and 25th in air yards for Demaryius Thomas. So there's a huge role opening up for Sutton, but I guess maybe I'm an interesting case to be doing this because I have a lot of Demaryius Thomas. He's on a lot of my teams, and I think more than anything, poor quarterback play let him down because his sort of output is going to be pretty reliant on QB play. Manny Sanders can play with bad quarterbacks because he's so good after the catch, and Thomas at this point in his career, not a run after the catch sort of guy, even though he was earlier in his career. So, with the Texans offense having Coutee in the slot, having Hopkins outside and Thomas outside, they just look a lot more dynamic. We watched that Thursday night game where Tyler Ervin was playing in the slot, where they were using Jordan Thomas. Jordan Akins was out there blocking a lot. They've added a real, above average quality NFL wide receiver to that offense, basically in the spot that Tyler Ervin was playing. I am kind of interested in all of this to see what happens with Coutee, because I think part of my evaluation of Coutee up until now was under the assumption that he was going to be getting a lot of high value underneath targets, but now he might be getting the even more high value down the field targets that saw Will Fuller be, kind of a fantasy superstar. I don't think that this changes Hopkins' expectation much, but it definitely means that someone like Jordan Thomas, Tyler Ervin, these guys are not worth a waiver claim. Just got a question in the chat. Would I spend a number 1 waiver claim on Courtland Sutton? Definitely. We also got another comment in the chat asking if DT would play the slot. For me right now, I think that seems unlikely. The Texans offense likes to keep smaller, shiftier guys in the slot. They did Bruce Ellington there. They tried Coutee played there a lot earlier in the year. In the past, they've used guys like Braxton Miller there. So when you look at how Bill O'Brien and the Houston offense kind of centers themselves, generally it's with the bigger, slower kind of, out route kind of guys. Those guys play outside. I would say that if Thomas does in fact play the slot, that's probably pretty good for his value, because that means they plan on transitioning him into a high value role. Just got a question, DT or Sutton rest of the season? I think it has to be Thomas. Sutton is definitely a good waiver ad, but I think there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of how productive he's going to be with those targets, because if you look at the role he's inheriting, it's going to be a low value role. It's going to be a low percentage role. So a lot of the type of looks that he's going to they're going to be down the field. They're going to be in tight spaces without a ton of room for yards after the catch. So I think that just means he's going to have a lot of weeks where he could have 7 targets but only have 2 receptions for 58 yards. I think Sutton probably has a higher touchdown expectation than anyone else in that offense rest of the way, because he's going to be he's the red zone threat on that offense now. He's not splitting that with Thomas. He's not splitting that with the tight ends. But I would take DT over Sutton rest of the year simply because he's transitioning into a better offense. I think the biggest negative of all of this, the person who loses the most from this is KeKe Coutee, because he was looking set to get, tons of targets. We're looking at like 8 targets. Another question in the chat, Sutton or Geronimo Allison rest of the season? Definitely Sutton. Geronimo Allison is kind of left for dead. The Packers, they rotated in MVS and Equanimous St. Brown, Win Cobb, and Allison returned to the lineup. So Allison's kind of dead. So biggest takeaways from this, Sutton, definitely worth a lot of waiver dollars, definitely worth, Sutton is worth a number 1 waiver claim. I would put, $20, $25 of fab, whatever you have left on Sutton. If Thomas might be out there in one of your leagues, Thomas has been disappointing, and I know some people listening to this, you're not playing super competitive high stakes leagues. If Thomas is out there, I think he's certainly an ad. And as someone who owns Thomas, right now I'm going through all of my leagues, and I'm realizing I don't have a ton of moves to make because I just have Thomas in all these leagues already. So as a big Thomas advocate, huge on this news. I think this is great for his touchdown expectation. I think his target volume might shift a little bit week to week because he will definitely be behind Hopkins, and I think he's likely to be behind, he's likely to be behind Coutee in terms of raw targets, but Thomas, well, I guess it depends on who plays the slot in between, who gets more targets between Coutee and Thomas, but they'll be pretty close, but clearly they'll be a 2A and a 2B behind Hopkins. But I think everyone in this trade wins, certainly other than Coutee. This was a good deal for both the Broncos and for the Texans. So in terms of action you guys can take in your leagues right now, I think sending out a trade offer for Demaryius Thomas is reasonable. I think sending out, trade offers for Courtland Sutton, reasonable. If you're in a dynasty league, this is actually probably one of the best times to trade for Will Fuller. I believe Thomas has like a giant cap number that the Texans would be looking to get off after this season when Fuller's ready to come back. But, go ahead and spend those waiver dollars on Courtland Sutton. Go ahead and send some trade offers for Demaryius Thomas, and, if you have KeKe Coutee, hope that he really transitions well into that Fuller role and is able to come down with some deep targets.